Obviously, I'm not Rick. I'm Suzanne. Thank y'all all for coming out tonight. I know it's been a long evening. You've been up since the crack of dawn, getting your kids to work and school them to school and you to work. But if you'll just hang on, we just have a few more minutes to share about Tripp. Mr. Howard read my mind in thinking that I want to erase that stereotypical image you have of an alcoholic, of a drug addict, of a drug user. Because as you saw with Brad, wasn't he an all-American, awesome-looking boy? That's not what you have in your mind. That's not what you think. So even Tripp's friends, when they found out we were going to talk about him tonight, they said, please don't let those folks think he was an addict. Tell him what he really was. So even young people don't see that. They have in their minds the same stereotypical image that we do. So Rick was asked to speak, and I horned in on it. No, actually, he was kind enough to let me talk about Tripp too, because I love to. But my mind began racing, thinking, how in the world can I let those people know what a fine, amazing, wonderful, kind boy he was? I thought immediately, I'll gather all his accomplishments, his awards, the poems he wrote, the songs, the short stories. I can get all the anecdotes that his teachers and friends told me about him, what a great person he was. I could get the Crimson and White wrote an awesome obituary that really captured his personality. I'll bring that. And I'll bring the book that his friends published of all his writings to give money to charity, sold for money for charity. I'll bring all that. And then I realized, am I preparing for show and tell? Is this just a sales presentation? You see, that's what happens when your child dies as a result of something that society deems as shameful. You just want to do anything you can to negate that mental image in their head. You want to just shout, but he was a good, kind boy. Because he was. But thank you for letting us share about Tripp. He was a good boy, and I'm so proud of him.
Tripp had a wonderful core group of friends that had a really unique bond. Johnny Hicks is back there. Trey Lewis is going to sing here in just a minute when I get finished with what I've got to say. And Suzanne, I appreciate them being here and trying to help us introduce Tripp to y'all. I want to thank Charlotte Shaw and Leadership Vestavia and for everybody who's been involved in this program. Charlie asked me a couple of months ago if I would speak. It's amazing how quickly August the 18th got here. I started thinking, I thought, I need to write down some notes about what I want to talk about. And I started doing that Saturday morning, and very quickly I wrote down 22 pages of notes about Tripp. Y'all are probably thinking, for crying out loud, you mean we're going to have to go through this guy reading 22 pages? I'm going to try and be quick, because I know if Tripp were here, he would say, come on, Dad, you can't take that long. Tripp was an incredible blessing for Suzanne and I for 22 years. As most of you know, he grew up here in Vestavia, went to Vestavia West, went to Bazitz Middle and graduated from the high school in 2006. From there, he went to school in Tuscaloosa and was awarded a posthumous degree from the University of Alabama in 2011. Tripp loved to write. Suzanne just mentioned that just a minute ago. He was never without a pad in his pocket. He loved to write songs, but he also wrote short stories and poems. And at the time of his death, he was being, one of his short stories had been submitted to the university for the best short story at the University of Alabama. He played music and played in bands since he was in middle school. His musical tastes were not my particular musical taste, but he was incredibly passionate about his music. And you're going to hear it in just a minute when we get the video going. There was a song selected, Jukebox, on my grave, and nobody would have liked a jukebox on their grave rather than the headstone that we got for Tripp. He was an amazing person who impacted so many people's lives for good. Tripp was also an alcoholic, and he was someone who struggled with drug addiction. And because of the way that he died, Suzanne and I felt compelled tonight to talk to you about our story. And I want to do that through what I consider mental images or snapshots that are in my mind about the course of his life and the time that we have spent reflecting on his life over the past 3 years. And I can't do that without talking to you about the first snapshot that comes to my mind, and it's a law and order kind of snapshot. You're probably thinking, what in the world is that? For just a few minutes, I want to talk to you about February 25th, 2011. It's the day Tripp died. Suzanne and I had been helping with her brother, Wally, who for 17 months had been battling brain cancer. I was on my way to Baldwin County for trial, and Suzanne called me right about the Georgiana exit and said, Rick, hospice is called. Wally's not going to make it through the night. You need to come home. And so I did. I got everything continued, and I headed back. Suzanne and I hurried over to her brother's house so we could be with the family and plan his memorial service. We stayed there until about 11 o'clock that night. And Suzanne and I both realized, along with the family, that Wally wasn't going anywhere. And I said, you know something, Suzanne, I got to go home. Because I'd been at it since about 6 o'clock that morning, so we headed to the house, and we got in bed at maybe 11:30 that night. And I remember passing out. I don't even remember taking my shoes off. But we hit the bed, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, we get a phone call. Now, over the course of Tripp's years, I'd had several phone calls in the middle of the night, so that wasn't surprising to me, but we got a phone call, and I answered the phone, and I couldn't understand what the guy was saying. And so I thought, well, maybe I'm going to just assume that this is a prank call. And so I turned the phone off, put it down. About 5 seconds later, it rang again, and I looked, it was the same number. I told Suzanne, I said, hey, this one's yours. You're going to have to deal with this one. I knew that something wasn't right. When she sat up in the bed and she turned on the light, and someone had called and said that Tripp was having problems and that they had taken him to UAB. Suzanne and I were confused because Tripp lived in Tuscaloosa. He was in school in Tuscaloosa about 10 hours from graduating. And I thought, what in the world's he doing in Birmingham? Well, we find out later that he was playing music. And whoever called said, I tell you what, they think, because I asked Suzanne, I said, find out what's going on. Is he going to be okay? And they said, yeah, he's going to be okay. And so we took off, got our clothes on. I do remember saying to Suzanne, I said, do you think, regardless of the circumstances, that you're going to be able to handle this? Because I knew that Tripp struggled with a lot of different problems. And she said, yeah, I can do it. I think I can do it. So we got in the car, and we both thought we could do it. We headed down 65. And I'll never forget, do what? My wife's motioned for me. I'm going to have to stay. I'm used to talking to people in the jury box, and I like to pound up and down in front of them like a preacher. But I'll stay behind this box so y'all can hear. I'm good. Thank you. So we got in the car. We're taking off down I-65, and Suzanne said, Rick, what in the world are you doing? And I said, what do you mean, what am I doing? I'm driving to the hospital. And she said, you're going 20 miles an hour. And I thought, are you serious? I looked at the speedometer, and sure enough, I was traveling 20 miles an hour. And I thought to myself, she can't wait to get there, and I don't want to get there. I remember when we got to the hospital, and there was some guy at the ER desk, and I tell you what, I can be difficult from time to time. And we got there, and I said, where's my son? And he said, I don't know who your son is. I said, here, this is his name, and I want you to take me to him. And I remember he said, look, we're going to get somebody to take you to this room over here. And I thought, what kind of room over there? I can go sit with everybody else. And they said, no, we'll take you to this room. I remember thinking, this doesn't really sound very good. And Suzanne and I went in a private room by ourselves, and I wasn't sure at that point what was coming. But I was certain that I wasn't in a room that I wanted to be. You see, for years, Suzanne's watched Law and Order. I don't watch Law and Order. But if she's sitting there, laying there watching that, I'm looking at something else. And every time Law and Order, they have one of those scenes where the parents are hovered over a dead child, I seem to want to put down what I'm looking at and take a look at that. It's kind of like watching a crash at Talladega, or a plane crash, or something bad. I remember thinking, what in the world would I do in that situation if I was like those people? Never good. I didn't realize at the time, but I was about to get my chance because we were in our little room, our private room by ourselves. And the first person that we saw was the hospital chaplain. Let me promise you something. It's never good when you get put in the private room and the hospital chaplain walks in the door. And she was followed by 3 doctors, an EMT, and detectives from the Birmingham Police Department. I don't know about y'all, but there are certain moments in my life that I have very vivid recollections of what's going on. I remember very clearly the birth of my children. I remember exactly where I was and what I was listening to when Paul Bryant died. I remember very clearly they came in, and the only words I heard was, "We're sorry." We did everything we could. And my initial reaction was, no, they're not talking about Tripp. Somebody said that he was going to be okay. They got this completely wrong. And I sat numb, and I was in complete disbelief. I never knew what shock was until I knew what that moment was. And I sat there staring. And before they could leave the room, I remember Suzanne saying, "I've got to see him." And that's why I call this my Law and Order moment, because I remember very vividly walking down a hospital aisle, had green tile, never forget that, toward what seemed like the largest room I'd ever seen. I don't know if the room was all that big, but I do know when we got there, the only thing that I saw in the middle of it was a metal table. And on that metal table was a body with a sheet. And I thought, I wonder if that's him. And I saw his curly hair. Only way I could identify him from where we were, and we kept on walking, and we got over to the side of that metal table, and he was laying there with a tube coming out of his mouth. He wasn't breathing. I checked. Wasn't doing anything. He was dead. I'll never forget what Suzanne did, because I just stood there and stared. You know, when Tripp was a baby, what Suzanne would do when he was little, it didn't matter how cold it was. If he was covered up, what she liked to do is to uncover him and look at his hands and look at his feet. The snapshot, the mental image that I have of February 25th, 2011, the very last time I had an opportunity to see my son was my wife pulling the covers back, pulling the sheet back, one last time to look at his hands and what had grown to size 15 feet, one last time. And that's an image I'm certain that I'm going to carry with me as long as I'm living. Y'all are probably thinking, for crying out loud, we didn't wait to hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes to end with some kind of miserable story like that. Why would you come and tell me such a horrible story? I'm convinced the greatest way that I can honor my son is for you to learn from mine and Suzanne's story. because I know there are probably other people in this room that have similar stories. But for those of you who don't, I don't want anybody to have those kind of memories. You know, somebody asked me not too long ago, what's it like to lose a child to a drug overdose? I had never lost one to anything other than that, so I really can't comment on that, but I know what it's like to lose a child. And I can tell you that nothing is ever quite the same. It's been 3.5 years since Tripp passed. And I kept wanting there to be a new normal. Everybody said, well, you know, it'll get normal again. It'll just be a new normal. My experience is there is no new normal. Every aspect of my life has a memory of Tripp. If I go to the grocery store, he was the thirstiest kid you ever saw. Every time I go down the drink aisle, I think about him. Every time I pass this ballpark coming home, I think about him. Every time I go to a ball game in Tuscaloosa, I think about him. Suzanne and I went to San Diego recently. We thought, you know, this would be a good time to get away, and we got to San Diego and thought that was really where we wanted to be, and we'd been there with Tripp not too long before that, and we decided we really didn't want to be there because of the memories that we had of the time that we spent with him there. I remember when I was at work, and I work on the 18th floor of a building downtown. I could see the interstate, and when I got back to work, I remember sitting at my desk looking at the interstate and watching cars go by, and I thought to myself, do they not understand what's happened in my world? Don't these people have any idea? One of the things I find myself doing, I watch and I read everything that I can find over and over. I stalk his Facebook page. His friends are afraid of me. Trying to stay connected in some way. You know, people say when you lose your parents, you lose your past, and when you lose your children, you lose your future. You know, I'm not so concerned about my future. But I can't tell you that I don't have some degree of anger every day over the fact that Tripp did not get his future. He never got married. He never had children. He never had the opportunity to reach his dreams and goals for his life. And I've had that opportunity, and I wanted him to have it as well. I gladly would have traded places with him. And the real truth of it is I'm not whole anymore. I'm not going to tell you that I am. And when Tripp died, a part of me died as well. People ask me what it's like to lose your child. That, for me, that's what it's like to lose your child. Snapshot number 2 that I keep thinking about, call it searching for clues. I've got so many mental images of the time at the ballpark, trips that we took. Tripp was so comfortable to be around. He was perfect for me. And we spent a lot of time together. So a really big question for me was, what in the world did I do wrong? Something was wrong. You see, in my mind, prior to Tripp's death, overdose only happened to kids from troubled backgrounds. The wrong side of town. Tripp grew up involved in multiple activities. He played ball, he played baseball and wrestled and football at the park and at school. We took him to church regularly. We were involved in every aspect of his life, every one. Suzanne and I had a great marriage. If I had to go back 31 years again, I'd never pick somebody else. I mean, if I got to have a wife that I got to walk through losing a child with, I can't imagine being married to anybody else. Suzanne and I had a great marriage. Tripp had no family drama to deal with. He had grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins that loved him. They spent time with him. They were involved with him. So what was it? Suzanne and I were living at the Homewood Suites, and that's another tale of misery that I won't bore you with. But our house flooded, and so we were there. And one day she brought in the mail. I'll never forget. And it's this yellow envelope right here from the Jefferson County Coroner Medical Examiner's Office. It was Tripp's autopsy. I can't tell you how long this laid in our Homewood Suites room without ever opening it. And I'd come in at night and I'd stare at the envelope until one night I thought, I can't believe I'm scared of that thing. I'm going to open that up. Surely that's got some clues. And I did. I have read every word of this autopsy report 10 million times. Cause of death, morphine abuse. You see, that's the way heroin breaks down. Manner of death, accident, contributory cause, ethanol abuse. Nobody ought to have to read their own child's autopsy, I'll tell you that. 10 pages of what his organs weighed. But I didn't find any answers. I got this nifty little bag here from the Jefferson County Coroner's Office. It's got his billfold. The money that he had $2 in his billfold. Had an ATM receipt where he checked out $20 to buy a hit of heroin. 2 hours before he died. 5 quarters, 3 dimes, 2 pennies, a Roy Orbison keychain that I stole. I've examined every single thing in this bag hundreds of times, looking for answers and looking for clues. There's no clues in either the autopsy report. There's no clues in that bag. I questioned every decision that I made as a parent. I looked for clues everywhere. I looked for someone to blame. But don't think I hadn't tried to blame this on somebody else, because I have. More than 1/2 of overdoses occur in the presence of other people, and Tripp was with at least 4 other people when he died. And when they realized he was in trouble, they hit the door. They left him there to die. So I wanted to blame them. You know, one of the points that you need to talk to your kids about is when drugs are involved and the police are on the way, you're not going to have any friends. So I wanted to blame them. More than anything else, I blame myself, and I can't constantly come back to why. You know, I think, did I work too much? Because I did. Did I ignore all the obvious signs? And how in the world could I have been so stupid? I read that every 14 minutes another family begins the process of enduring the pain of an overdose death. You know, one of Tripp's friends was cutting my hair recently, and I questioned her about drug use and when it started with Tripp. And she said it started with everybody early. The prevalence of drugs and alcohol was amazing to me at an early age in Vestavia. Always available, always accessible at parties. And I was shocked to learn that our kids are living in a different world than I lived in. I've seen the news recently where there are 2 houses that have been raided within a rock's throw of the high school where people are selling drugs. There are no barriers to drugs. They cross every social and economic boundary. I can tell you this, heroin is an equal opportunity substance because it crosses all lines. What conclusion did I come to after all my searching for clues? Because I've been searching and searching and searching. Here's the conclusion that I came to. It can look like everything is all right when in reality everything is all wrong. Snapshot 3. I'll never forget the last real conversation that I had with my son. He had come home over the weekend from Tuscaloosa, and we split a dozen Krispy Kreme donuts at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning before he died. He came home from the weekend to help clean out a storage shed, and I could tell he was troubled. He was on the couch in the sunroom, and I thought, you know what better way for me to get him to open up, and this is a tip, I guess, than to go to Krispy Kreme and get a box of hot donuts to talk to your son. That's a joke. I don't really mean that. And I remember saying, Tripp, look, if you need some help, come home and I'll get you the help you need. And he never, ever, ever acknowledged that there was a problem. And he headed back to Tuscaloosa for the final week of his life. Which brings me to this point. If you have an opportunity to help your child, do it. I knew he needed help, and I didn't do it. Do whatever you got to do. Get them out of school. Get them away from their friends. Leave town if you have to. You know, one of the points that I think that has to be made is Tripp was so ashamed of his drug use. He didn't want us to know. He didn't want his friends to know. He didn't want anybody to know. And his friends that are here tonight will tell you that when he was using, he left. He wanted to do it by himself. He did everything he could to hide it. I look on the autopsy report. Because I looked. I don't know a whole lot about heroin. But I do remember looking at his body thinking, I wonder if he's shooting anything, injecting anything. And the heroin, apparently you can inject a lot of different ways. When I look at the autopsy report, one of the things that stood out to me is that he was shooting it between his toes. He was shooting it in his lower extremities so nobody would know. And so nothing was said, and he struggled in absolute silence. I never recognized the extent of the problem because Tripp was functional. He went to class. He was doing well in his classes, making decent grades. So he was ashamed, and I think deep down, and I'm ashamed to say this, but I think deep down I was ashamed too. It was so hard for me with his drugs and his alcohol because I always wanted to fix things for my kids when they messed up, and this was something I couldn't fix. He always said it wasn't true. He trained me to leave him alone about it. Your kids will do that. They'll train you. And he did. He trained me well. And so I left him alone. And he gave me all the information that he wanted me to have, and I accepted it. You know, the University of Alabama has a nice memorial to students who passed away over the past year. And Suzanne and I attended, and I didn't know any of the other kids who passed. But for some strange reason, I came back from that memorial and I started looking them up. And I found out that at least 6 of the 12 people that they honored at that memorial had died from alcohol and drugs. I started looking at their obituaries. And they said the exact same thing that Tripp's did, and that is they either died or they died suddenly. You see, I wrote the words for Tripp's obituary. And if you look at it, it said Tripp Norris died suddenly. These other students did as well. They either died or they died suddenly. I look back up Suzanne's brother who died a week after Tripp with brain cancer. Said Wally Barker died after a 17-month struggle, a long and courageous struggle with cancer. Nobody could have fought it any harder than Wally did. I'll agree with that. But I've had time to think about that, and now I wonder why. When I wrote my son's obituary, why in the world did I not put, my son died after a long and courageous battle with alcohol and drug addiction? If Wally Barker were here, if Suzanne's brother were here, and he could walk on this stage, I can promise you this. He would gladly tell you that his struggle was no more long and it was no more courageous than my son's. You see, my perception of a drug user before Tripp passed was someone who lived on the fringes that nobody cared about. When I thought of a drug addict, I had in my mind some wide-eyed, crazy person that lived in filth somewhere else. And man, if you talk to me, I could provide wonderful moralizing commentary about self-destructive behavior, and don't think Tripp didn't hear it from me. It's amazing how it took the death of my son to change my whole perspective about addiction. In all honesty with you, I continue to be conflicted about addiction. But one of the things I'm really, really clear on that I would have never said before Tripp passed, I'm confident that addiction is a disease, and it brings about prejudices about what is socially acceptable. I think science is clear. Addiction is not a moral choice. I'm convinced that addiction is no choice at all. Don't get me wrong. It's voluntary the first few times. There's no question about that. But there's people who take drugs, 10% of, I've read, they continue to use. They can't help it. It opens up a Pandora's box that they're never able to close. I've never been addicted to drugs or alcohol, so I don't have any idea what that's like. But you know something? I've been addicted to donuts and candy and cake. Hopeful periods of dieting followed by devastating trips to the scale when I went on a candy binge. I mean, we all have some experiences, don't we, where we fail to live up to the skinny, sober ideas of our society. People with addictions are no worse than the rest of us, and their passing leaves no less of a hole. I didn't have my first dozen donuts because I wanted to be a fatso. And I'm certain that Tripp didn't have his first hit of heroin because he wanted to be an addict. He was in an age where he thought he was invincible. Kids don't think anything bad's going to happen. He lived his life with no fear. And that's the way he died. But he was so ashamed of his addictions. He was an incredibly bright, gifted, extraordinary person who died drunk while shooting heroin, and that's so hard for me to accept. He struggled in silence and died doing something that he was so ashamed of. No one likes to talk about drugs. No one likes to talk about addiction. But we can't ignore it anymore. And where does that leave us? For me, I think Vestavia as a community has got to create an environment in which our young people no longer feel ashamed to talk about addiction and how it's affecting those and the ones they love. Nobody was better at playing the blame game than I was before Tripp passed. We've got to lay off the blame game. It's time to start talking about it. And I think this is so important. It's not a discussion that you as parents need to have. It's a discussion that you have got to have with your children. You've got to. I can tell you, apparently for me, it was easier to be in denial of myself and other people. But we've got to be honest, because drugs have robbed this city of too many of its best and brightest. It's a disease from which no one is immune. Regardless of where you live, your upbringing, the most horrible nature of the drug to me is that it robs you of your dignity. And we've got to find a way to make it a disease that carries a little more dignity than it does. We just got to. You're probably sitting there thinking, will this guy ever shut up and tell us how to stop it? I mean, what's the answers? Come on. So you waited this long. I'm going to tell you what the answer is. I don't have a doggone clue. I have no idea. But I know this, you can't love a kid anymore, Suzanne, and I love that one. So love can't stop heroin. Love can't stop overdoses. What will? I wrote down 4 things. Awareness. We've got to create an awareness in this community that drugs are a real problem here, because nobody could ever convince me of that before Tripp died. I would have never believed it. Through meetings just like this, the discussion has begun. You've got to keep it going. Don't look away. Use me as the example that looked away and ignored the apparent problems of my son. Second thing, we've got to change our perspective on addiction. You're never going to hear me stand up and say, we need to glorify addiction. We need to glorify drug use. No way. But it can't continue to carry the same stigma and shame, or we're going to continue to lose kids who are continuing to struggle in silence. We got to create an atmosphere where you can have a discussion. And you see, I didn't do that. Even the last time that I shared donuts with Tripp, I don't share donuts with a whole lot of people. Suzanne can tell you that. I don't share my desserts. But he knew where I stood on drugs. And he knew it was a closed conversation. And so he was never willing to talk to me about it. You've got to create an atmosphere where you can have a discussion with your kids. It took his dying to change my perspective. Don't let that happen to you. Last thing I'd say is you've got to change the rules. Most likely the friends are not going to tell you, and I'm old. But I'm not too old to remember that there's a code of silence among friends. I never would have told on my buddies. We got to create new rules. I mean, young people may think, well, something, I'll lose my friend if I tell. You got to get them to change the rules, because they may lose them for good if they don't. We got to break the rules. Suzanne and I had an opportunity to talk with a number of Tripp's friends in preparation for this meeting, and every one of them, every single one of them, said, don't you dare focus on the way that he died. I hope I hadn't done that. Because for Suzanne and I, his life is never going to be defined by addiction and overdose. Tripp was an amazing person and son who was loved so powerfully by his friends. And we'll always keep him alive by continuing to talk. And we'll always grieve. Kind of sound like Jimmy Valvano here, but I can tell you, heroin took Tripp's life. But it's not ever going to take his memories. It's never going to take his character. And I'm not ever going to let it take his dignity. I wouldn't be doing this community right and the people in this room right if I didn't say thank you. We had a memorial service for Tripp, and it was incredibly attended by the people of this community. This is a community that loves its children. That's obvious to me, and it continues to be obvious to Suzanne and I, and that's why we'll always call this our home. Tripp loved music. I can't think of a better way to finish than to have Trey Lewis come. Trey is a Vestavia boy who was a wonderful friend of Tripp's. Suzanne and I are so proud of Trey. Trey is playing music at a lot of different places now, and he has a new album out. Trey struggled with all of the issues that we've talked about tonight, and he is 7 years sober. But Trey's here tonight to sing a song after this little short video, and it's about overcoming addiction. And the name of the song is "The Man That I've Become." He's Trey Lewis. Suzanne and I can't tell you how much we appreciate y'all being here. And thank y'all so much for listening.
What do you know, I'm living right. Took a while and some sleepless nights, but I finally turned myself to the light, and I'm really moving on. People say I cleaned up good. Now I'm doing better than I know I should. I should be dead in all likelihood, but instead I'm writing you to say how much I know I truly let you down. And I know I never was a real good man like you have now. And I'm so sorry for the wreckage damage that I've done. See, I never knew I was just 12 steps away from the man that I've become. I let go in steps 1 and 2. 3, I prayed God would get me through. Man, 4 and 5 was so hard to do, but the good Lord knows I did it. Step 6 changed how I looked at things, and I finished 7 in early spring. 8 made a list of people I'd done wrong, so tonight I'm writing you to say how much I know I truly let you down. And I know I never was a real good man like you have now. And I'm so sorry for the wreckage and damage that I've done. See, I never knew I was just 12 steps away from the man that I've become. Each and every day, and one day they say that I can give it all away, but until then I'm writing you to say how much I know I truly let you down. And I know I never was a real good man like you have now. And I'm so sorry for the wreckage and damage that I've done. See, I never knew I was just 12 steps away from the man that I've become. Thank you for letting me be a part of this.